This video is sponsored by MAURER Digital. Though we already have and will continue to see and analyze more art from the ancient world, in this video, I want to expose you to the types of material art that were common in Mesopotamia during the Bronze and Iron Ages. The first and most common type of art from ancient Mesopotamia is pottery made out of baked clay. It's often the most useful artifact for archaeologists because changes in the style of pottery or other ceramic objects can help them to identify and date the different early cultures that once occupied a given area. Bowls, jars, cups, boxes, and other objects, or at least fragments of them, have been found all over Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent. One can say that it's the oldest recognized art form in the ancient Near East. Though often formed in distinctive shapes and painted with geometric designs and later animals, the pottery of ancient Mesopotamia, even during times of great cultural achievement and prosperity, was relatively basic in comparison to those of other cultures. The earliest clay pottery to have been discovered dates back to around 7000 BC and was shaped by hand and then baked over an open fire. About 1,000 years later, hotter, more controlled firing was made possible with the introduction of primitive kilns, which themselves were made out of baked clay bricks. In addition to shaping them by hand, early potters also used simple molds into which they pressed moist clay, which were then baked over a hand-operated potter's wheel. Over time, as this technology advanced, it allowed for the mass production of such bowls and jars, which were needed to help feed the growing population. Though by 2000 BC, some pottery in Babylonia and also Assyria began to be glazed in bright colors, they were still relatively simple in comparison to those of Egypt, and later, the Greek-speaking world. This is because most people who could afford ornately decorated pottery actually preferred jars, bowls, and utensils made of silver, gold, copper, bronze, glass, or even stone, all materials that we'll take a look at shortly. Before we get into the next form of artwork, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video, MAURER Digital, and introduce you to their exciting Berlin Wall NFT project. I found this to be extremely interesting because, as the name implies, it's an NFT art project that tells the extraordinary stories of the Berlin Wall to both raise awareness of its history and raise money for various charities. The project brings together 5 talented artists who are building a digital Berlin Wall consisting of 10,316 unique art pieces, one for each day that the wall stood. The goal is to introduce new generations to that turbulent and important era of history and what the fall of the wall represented in the fight for democracy and freedom. Each NFT tells a different story about the lives and struggles of the people who were affected by it, and the general impact that it had on the spread or curtailment of democracy and individual freedoms. The great thing about the project is that the majority of the proceeds go to various globally recognized charities and organizations that promote freedom, fairness, and democracy, including Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, and more. To date, the Berlin Wall NFT project has raised over $250,000 for such charities in its first 2 drops, which were completely sold out. The next drop will be on January 18th, and if the previous 2 are any indication, will sell out fast. So, if interested in this unique project, check out the links in the video description or visit MAURER Digital on the web. Of all of the crafts in ancient Mesopotamia, metalworking was probably the most important. It was essential to all aspects of life, such as agriculture, where it was used as the primary material for plows, to, of course, weapons and armor made of bronze and iron. It had its household purposes as well, and was used for cups, bowls, jars, and the like. Such items were not only considered more valuable than their clay and ceramic counterparts, but also much more durable. Though archaeologists have excavated the remains of several metalsmith workshops, most of the metals smelted there were actually not from the region. Mesopotamia had, and still has, few deposits of useful metals, and so these had to be imported. For example, most of the copper that found its way into the great cities of Sumer and Akkad came from Anatolia, Iran, and Canaan. Tin was even harder to get, and likely came from mines in Anatolia and as far away as Central Asia. Both of these elements are needed for the creation of bronze, which by the 4th millennium BC became the principal alloy for many useful objects, such as weapons, helmets, cooking utensils, pins, plows, plates, and eventually for statues, both of gods and kings. Though used much less, gold, silver, and electrum, which is a mixture of gold and silver, were also relatively common in the urban centers of Mesopotamia. Due to their malleability, these metals were used a lot in jewelry. We'll get to that shortly. Though the use of iron has been dated to at least the 4th millennium BC, it didn't really take hold in Mesopotamia until its widespread use by the Hittites, which encouraged its adoption by others around the end of the Bronze Age. So this brings us to another common type of material art that we see in ancient Mesopotamia, and that is jewelry, which used many of the metals and alloys mentioned earlier. In addition, most fine or luxury jewelry included precious and semi-precious stones, such as lapis lazuli and jade. Like most metals, these were also imported, mostly, scholars believe, from Afghanistan. From objects discovered in the graves of elites, as well as reliefs from the walls of buildings, both men and women valued and wore jewelry. Common to both genders of higher social status were strings of beads, amulets, and bracelets made of bronze, silver, or gold. Earrings were also popular, and generally in the shape of rings, crescent moons, cones, and sometimes animal or human heads. Next, we come to my personal favorite art from ancient Mesopotamia, cylinder seals. These were generally made out of small pieces of stone or clay, but sometimes also copper, bronze, silver, gold, bone, lapis lazuli, or even shell. They were engraved with pictures and/or short inscriptions that formed impressions when pushed onto soft surfaces, which were usually wet clay. The images could depict anything: a specific event, the image of a ruler or priest, complex geometric patterns, an animal, a scene from daily life, or a battle. But most seem to have had some religious meaning or reference, and contained images of deities, or some scene from Sumerian or local mythology. Creating the images on cylinder seals was delicate work, and due to their curved rather than flat surfaces, it was quite difficult for the artist to create correctly proportioned scenes and figures. Like the seals of today, these impressions were used to identify or verify official documents. Cylinder seals have been found on official royal correspondence, legal documents, marriage contracts, account ledgers, on jars, doors, basically any surface where some sort of verification was necessary. Cylinder seals have been extremely important finds for archaeologists because they've provided valuable information about ancient Mesopotamian religion, mythology, kings, governors, and other rulers, and have even helped to verify the dates of specific events. During the 3rd millennium BC, sculpture became an important form of artistic expression in both Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East in general, though it had been around for much longer than that. Actually, thousands of years before the first cities. The earliest sculptures were made of clay, but much like other forms of art that we've discussed, they were soon formed out of other materials, including wood, different types of stone, and metals such as copper and bronze. Some were hybrids that were carved or whittled from wood and then covered with thin metal. An example of this are the remains of the bull-headed harp found in the royal cemetery of Ur. The core material was wood, but it was covered by thin layers of gold and embellished with lapis lazuli. The best preserved sculptures that we have are those made of stone, many of which can still be seen in museums all over the world. Good stone, though, was hard to find, and so much of it had to be imported from other areas, such as southwestern Anatolia and the mountains of Iran. Most of the limestone, gypsum, and alabaster that we see in statues, figurines, and wall reliefs came from these areas. However, the most valuable or prize stone was diorite, which was mostly imported from what's today Oman, in those days known as Magan or Makan. While for many, sculptures were luxury items and may have been used for decoration, most seem to have had a religious purpose and were used as votive offerings, to be placed in temples and other sites considered to have been holy. It was believed that such statues, especially those of deities and even individuals, contained the spirit or essence of the one being represented inside them. Perhaps the greatest number of surviving statues and reliefs come from what was once ancient Assyria, specifically the palaces and temples of Kalhu or Nimrud, Dur-Shuruken, Ashur, and of course, Nineveh. Whether they were statues of great kings, animals, mythical creatures, or reliefs on wall panels depicting great battles or glorifying rulers, sculpture in Mesopotamia seems to have reached its zenith during the Neo-Assyrian period. So, I hope that you now know a bit more about some of the primary material arts of ancient Mesopotamia, which you'll be seeing a lot more of in upcoming videos. As always, thank you so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. I'd also really like to thank GrandKeg69, Jaap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Danny Van Eck, WNXTV, Robert Morgan, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Hurtado Correa, Franz Robbins, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.